good presentations this morning. There's got to be some questions about that.
Just on your studies, did you see you did 4 or 5 replications with your test?
Yeah, so we won't publish it unless we have 3 reps of data. So we plant 4 to 5. Some new locations will have 6 reps that we plant, but on harvest. I got that question earlier about what software did we use. We used to use ARM. That's what a lot of universities they use to evaluate statistical analysis data. But because we see that variability and we want that variability, I mean, it would kick things up, and our CVs would go to 12, 15. So over the years, I've designed a spreadsheet that kicks the big outliers out, and then we compare that back to that yield map. So if it's a big outlier and it shows on the yield map, then we kick the data out. So, but our CVs typically are in like technical analysis, 2 to 2.5 CV is kind of the highest acceptable. We'll run it at 5 to 6. But again, it's because we want that variability. Any other questions?
Larry, make sure to speak up so everybody can hear.
Good. Oh, yeah. Okay.
Now it's time to talk about our question we had here.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, we were visiting a little bit about some of us have been using an insecticide in furrow as a preventative for rootworms, and then the purchase of traits for rootworm protection. And in my situation, I've used a generic capture for quite a few years, probably again. I really don't see a lot of evidence of rootworms. And as Scott was telling about, you had some really heavy pressures of rootworms, and you could use capture as well, and it didn't seem like hard to face it. I guess our question is, would we use some of these things for a certain period of time? Is it even going to work if I need it? If you use something safely for, it's a corn tripping rotation, so it's not in a year course, but it's been 4 or 5 times in the last 10 years. So am I fooling myself thinking I have some protection, and that's my concern, I guess.
Did you get a question, Dan?
Yeah, I did. That was relative to capture and furrow, is that correct?
Yeah.
That's what we were using,
We've
yeah.
been using by fencemen. We've been keeping up with the rates. I know people that have been using it are using higher rates all the time because it's been inexpensive. But the question is it doing any good?
Well, that's a challenge. Are you using the normal rate? Are you using a reduced rate? What are you using?
As I recall, 5.12 is the baseline rate. I think we're using 8 or 10.
I think most people are up to 10.
Okay. Yeah. Well, as a general rule, it probably is going to work fairly decently on larvae that are small, but if the other thing is whether or not the bifenthrin is going to last long enough in the furrow to get you work done on later in the season. And is it just in furrow that the issue exists? No. Of course, capture is supposed to have some systemic activity, but it really kind of depends on when those rootworms are coming into the cycle and when they're getting you. That's one of the reasons why the old stuff that was so wicked, the Temex and the Thymex and the counters and Puridans and stuff like that, they were fairly long-lived and they were wicked poison, and so they typically got the job done longer into the season, and that's why the bifenthrin doesn't have the same killing activity. It still can be an insecticide, but it's going to be mostly up front. It's not going to last as long in the furrow.
I'm going to piggyback on his comments too, because we've also used bifenthrin, and the last few years we've had some pretty good corn rootworm infestations to where this past year, side-by-side fields, one that was third or fourth year corn, there was 100 bushel yield difference between that field and the side-by-side, went from 170 to 270.
saw some evidence here years back where guys were using pounds, generic pounds, bifenthrins, and some of them actually, threw a little force in there, and when they put the force back in there, of course that changed things, back in the right direction. I don't believe, and I don't think you'll ever convince me, I've been around corn all my life, I don't believe that even the corn rootworm genetics is going to hold it off significantly enough, even in the future, by itself, to maximize yield potential. It's going to pay for itself in getting probably the yield back that you need to pay for it in a bad situation. But even relying upon that all completely by itself isn't going to get the job done.
So then the question is biology gonna help?
The biology in terms of added biologicals, you mean?
Yes.
What it's going to do is just add one more step in the process of, just like everything else, in combining different herbicides, to try to get the resistance to be lesser and lesser. What it's going to do is allow one more step to help the corn tolerate the conditions. One of the things that the biologicals do, which you have to remember, those of us who lived through the corn rootworm insecticide years, remember everything was done on root ratings. And any of those that have a lack of hair or lots of gray, remember that, you remember root ratings. And there were many years when the root ratings, in some cases, coming into the pollination were terrible. And at the end of the year, it's like, well, gosh, the yield wasn't that bad. Got to remember that the reason the rootworm does what it does is it takes the roots off. If you have time and the weather to regrow roots to a certain extent, so that that poor root package did have some regeneration, you didn't get as much loss as you thought. And so one of the things that the biologicals do is allow for better regeneration of roots in a situation where rootworms might have got on them and chewed them up quickly. You'd have a better regeneration of roots if you have a good biological environment right in that furrow where the roots have been chewed off, right around the crown. So there are situations where, let's say, the biologicals could give you additional help in taking out some of those soft-bodied insects, but it may give you more help in helping regenerate roots quicker as rootworms try to knock them off. So it's just another step in the big picture.
That answer your question, Gary?
It's helpful.
It's hard to come up with a perfect solution.
Well, you know what? Let's go back to something that Nate said earlier when he had that biostimulants versus biologicals, and one failed you. Think about this: you would actually qualify gibberellic acid and IDA as root growth hormones. Root growth hormones are biostimulants. So if indeed you knew that you didn't do anything and all of a sudden rootworm is showing up with it on your fields and you can see it, then the proper use of a biostimulant would be to go in there and then actually apply some of your solus, which is your ethylene inhibitor, put a good slug of sugar on there and throw 2 to 4 ounces of a good root growth hormone onto that plant before you get to pollination. Once you get to pollination, it's harder to get those plants to go ahead and send roots down because they're used to getting things going the other way. But that's the use of a biostimulant program that would allow the physiology to kind of help quickly repair a bad problem that went wrong, and you'd use a biostimulant to fix that. So if you had biologicals in the furrow and you came back with a biostimulant package, you could regenerate roots quickly before you get to that extreme situation and lose a lot of yield potential.
But you couple that thought process with the dry summer, roots aren't going to regenerate in dry soil.
That's right. I mean, everything has its limitations, and that's why the reason I tell people is that's what a phone is for. That recommendation I made was something where, you're anticipating getting some moisture. If you got no moisture and it's too late, that's bad news.
So, in our situation where we don't, other than changing out of our rotation, going to corn bean rotation, does a guy put up with the health concerns of an index in order to work yourself through this problem? Or can a guy get a quick enough response out of the biologicals in year one? I mean, we're going into a field that a couple years ago, we had a lot of corn borer, and it was beans this past year, but it's going back into corn again. So have we had enough of a reprieve in that break to get by with a biological health there versus going with index?
Well, you got two questions to answer. One is, are we talking about westerns, southerns, or northerns? Do you know?
Well, I think
The rootworm species. Are we talking westerns or northerns?
western and northern.
Western and northern. So, you know, do you have diapause in your northern?
I can't answer that.
And the other thing is, have we scouted the beans? Because the westerns, you know, for the longest time, then jump back on the beans in some cases in the really dark brown. And so I don't know whether you guys suffer with that out there. Because the answer is, if you had a heavy population in the corn the year before, and just because you came back to beans does not mean that 1 year may fix a really bad, severe problem. I mean, the best thing happening is, you know, if we would get a really wicked winter and you froze it solid for an extended period of time, that's your best help. Well, I think Nate said a while ago, someone said there was only 4 inches of frost underneath there. That's not going to be enough. So,
Yeah.
you know,
We've got a big snow cover right now, so, that's probably not gonna be real good freezing.
no. So, I mean, it's hard for me to set this far away and push a button and say, this is what you need to do. But my suspicion is, if you had heavy rootworm and you had heavy rootworm this last season, and you noticed it was noticeable, my suspicion is, I mean, even 2 years ago, you're going to have a moderate amount this go round. Because I don't think rootworms have changed that much over the years, even though we tried to annihilate them, they haven't changed that much.
I'm thinking of an analogy, but it's, you know, it's if I wanted to get through this wall, right, I'd have to find a door to get through it. Or if I want to go through right here, I gotta take a saw and go right through it, right? Not the best thing, because Larry's gonna have a big hole in his wall just to be left. But I think of the same thing, because I deal with a lot of heavy rootworm pressure only when we have winters like this. Typically, we do freeze them off, and we don't typically see that year over year. But my biggest concern isn't just the nitrogen, it's what's going to be on this corn situation. So if corn on corn is exactly what I have to do, then I got to get a saw and cut through the wall. And what's left in the toolbox for you is something that's probably detrimental for some beneficials as well. So it's always 6 in one hand, half a dozen in the other. And in that case, it's if corn is exactly what you need to do, then my recommendation to you have to run that. Important stuff.
I think the other question is, what kind of, obviously, 100 bushel yield loss is not acceptable. I mean, even if I was looking at 100, as environmentally sound as I'd like to be, if I'm looking at 100 bushel yield loss, I'm going back to some insecticide. I mean, I'm not putting up with that, because I don't think even the technologies, you know, all together, in some cases, could buy that back. I mean, the timing is critical, and it's all dependent upon how the season develops for temperature and the soil. There isn't anything that's a given, but I do know one thing. If you annihilate it with counter or Thymet, those rootworms aren't going to live.
Well, to get us through this high incidence level, I guess that's what we're looking at. It's not something that we want to use long term, and if the biologicals are an option to build into the future, then, you know, that's probably the longer term solution maybe.
Right. The one thing I will tell you that has not been studied, because it hasn't been around long enough, is are moderated or minimal amounts of those heavier insecticides better with biological programs in the system. Because as we develop developing microbes in the system, we only need so much control of the rootworm to do the job. And that has not been done yet. And those insecticides, as powerful as they are, They're nerve poisons. These microbes aren't built like we are with nervous systems the same way. So those insecticides do not affect those biologicals, a lot of biologicals, as you might think. They're not going to annihilate them in furrow like that.
The only benefit of this whole thing is we're only increasing our corn acres by about 10 or 15%, so we're using it on maybe 300 acres of crop versus 1,500 acres. So.
Yeah, and I think that's the common sense of this whole thing is when we understand that these things are out here for tools and we use them properly. I don't see anybody who would stand out there and point fingers. Now, if you just said, well, I'm going to put it on all 3,000 acres, I just think that's economically it's suicide. It doesn't make sense environmentally either. But used as a proper tool, that's what these things are out there for. And you know, one of the questions that got brought up earlier in the day was, are the chemicals worse than the tillage? And as I was sitting here listening to it, it's a difficult thing to say. The tillage obviously oxygenates everything and makes the biology in the soil heat up organic matter. So it's probably, tillage is a greater detriment to the soil than just the chemicals. However, the thing we don't talk about, which is the dirty secret of the chemical industry, is oftentimes it's not the chemicals. The chemicals have been studied to the nth degree they had to be by the EPA. It's the carriers that are the problem. There are carriers out there that many of you have applied in the last 10 to 20 or 30 years, and some of those carriers are still out there. They're very hard to degrade. It's just like in glyphosate. Some of the surfactants they use are very, very difficult to degrade. So oftentimes it's not the chemicals, it's the carriers. And nobody talks about the carriers. It's like, oh, we don't have to study the carriers, that's what they do.
That's probably the biggest effect we see from biology is taking care of the carriers that we've used over the last 30 years or 40 years.
That's correct.
Develop biological that kill carriers.
Well,
We have
Or
some.
change carriers. I mean, there's carriers out there, and George didn't poke me, but, I mean, this is one of them. Replenish it's a natural, it's food grade biology. It's not gonna hurt anything. So there are options out there.
Yeah, there are options. We have several that will degrade, ring structures and several things. There are microbes available to do all that. It's just that since nobody talks about it, nobody really goes out there and tries to quantify what it's worth. But we've said for years that where we put the biology in the furrow and the plants are doing so much better, there's no question that some of that biology is finding some of those ring structures and finds a food source for themselves, and they're having a heyday out there.
Do you guys specifically target some of your microbe lineup for the purpose we're discussing?
Yeah, so that's something that we're doing actively. Dan, and I and Larry, we look at, as we learn more about specific microbes, we try and work those into, what we have, so that you're kind of getting that by default. And there's a few that we know of, Dave probably tests some of it, but there's a few that we know do a pretty good job of breaking those down, but the problem with it is sometimes there's a competitive effect that happens when you mix them with other things, so it's finding the right combination to make that product work and still have the benefit. But yeah, as we learn more about them, we're trying to work those in. I hope that was accurate, man.
Oh yeah.
So the biological package we buy from you next year was probably going to be tweaked and not the same as what we had last year.
Right.
Even though the label says the same, it's going to be
There's a certain,
tweaked every year.
right. But part of what we do, and I didn't really do a good enough job explaining it, but part of what we also try to do is to try and find bugs that are native to specific areas. So the packages that are coming here to Iowa, I try and look at what is the most efficient in Iowa, what's needed here, so that you're getting a more tailored package of what really you need. So a good percentage of it, 85, 90% is the same across the board, but there are some that are going to be different for you than what they are in, Dakotas or Ohio and things like that. So, and yeah, and as we get new ones, as we find new ones, I work those in.
It'll be a surprise to me if we change anything from Iowa, because Iowa farmers have always told the rest of the world what it is. They don't need anything out there.
There were some that you might talk a little about this, but there's some that, they, as we learned, they've of the carriers have some silica and things in it. So unfortunately, sometimes the answer is right in front of us, but we're looking in a different direction, so we don't see some of the tertiary benefits until afterwards.
Well, and I think the other thing is, you know, you've got to believe that 90 to 95% of the people buy product based on yield and return on investment. And in some cases, this stuff, if the surfactant package is carrying over bad enough in the field, it can be problematic. And if we get rid of that, you may see yield enhancement right away. The other side of that is soil health. And if you can get over 1 or 2 years, get the major problems cleaned up in the field and the soil health changes, the return may not come for, in some cases, 1 or 2 years. And so people don't have that kind of patience. So it's always incredible for, or more credible for us to put something else in those packages to try to help you gain yield out of it, and then put these other organisms in there simultaneously, and not really discuss too much about them, because it's like, well, you know, when am I going to get that benefit? Well, sometimes it's immediately, sometimes it could take a year or two. So we have to be trying to create products in the biological realm that are doing multiple things at once for you guys, to be able to make sure that one way or the other you're getting some return on investment out of those programs the very first year.
So that brings up a good topic. Nate, we never hit that this morning at all, but last year was probably not the greatest year to see a big response, yield response to biology. Part of that being just as dry as it was, but I don't know, what's your guys' take, Andy and Dan? I know there's some people in the room that would probably like to hear the answer to that. Why did we see, when we first started, you know, back in 2016 and 17, some really good responses back then, and now this last year, maybe 2 years, we haven't seen as much response to the biology.
Well, I think some of it is kind of indicative of other things that are going, I don't know what all has been added in the programs, but the weather's a big kind of factor in that whole process. They like to have sufficient amounts of water and more temperamental is not the right word, but you know that the lower the heat units are, the more they'll get active, which is backwards from those things. But I know here we looked, some of the things that we noticed were, even though we didn't necessarily see it on the yield side, we saw that there were still increases in test weight and nutrient density, which meant that they were still working. We just didn't have the water to really push what they were doing up into the plant. So there's other limiting factors that affect the performance of the biology that we have to kind of take into account too. So I hope
Well, it's a balance, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
Yeah.
I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but biology work best at 72 degrees soil temperature and 50% air and 50% water in the soil. So,
yeah.
you know, at their maximum
People
activity.
don't realize what we had last June. We had extremely high temps and very low rainfall.
My black soil at 1.5 inches to 2 inches, we were peaking at 95 degrees soil temperatures. So, I mean, that's detrimental in itself to what
Yes.
biological activity can do. And we're relying on these microbes to work in the top 6 inches of soil.
Right.
You know, and so you heard me say it earlier, the surface of the soil by June 1st is virtually non-existent. Unless you have cover crops or residue cover, things of that nature. But it's virtually non-existent. The top inch, then you've got, you know, maybe 20% of your activities within that. 2 inches, 20%. And then so you're relying on so much of that to be 3 to 4 inches below that soil surface. So it's a good point. It's a kind of a side note that might help understand better. We did a side dress depth study this year where we laid that side dress coulter at 2 to 3 inches with a knife, and then we put it down to 5 to 6 inches. And we saw a 2.5 bushel increase by just simply pushing that same rate of nitrogen 2.5 to 3 inches deeper, because we got it into the soil solution, where the biology are working, where it can then start to move towards those plant roots. It sat in that top dry. Until we got rain, we didn't do anything with that. So,
And Larry, something else I think we've seen, we've scouted the last couple of years, soil from different things, and metals and chemistries and herbicides and fungicides. So we're asking the bugs to do a lot more in an environment that isn't as favorable as what it was even 6 years ago. I mean, you take aluminum, for example, how much we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, that's on the rise. And so the environment, like Nate said, is, I think, playing more into this.
We spoke about this at our meeting back in December, about the edge effect,
Yep.
and that's a huge thing. I don't know if it was by you, Dave, but that's a huge thing around here.
We didn't see it. I saw yield maps was there, you know.
I mean, it was bad here, and we questioned whether some of
Yeah.
that's happening in I don't know how in depth I want to get there.
Yeah, we gotta be careful on camera, so, but there's, I can say this and feel pretty comfortable that there's a lot going on that, the average consumer doesn't know that we now have tangible data on, and it lines up with a lot of these things.
It falls into the realm of conspiracy, therefore we can't talk about it. The other thing, a couple other things to be thinking about here, folks, is your placement. With all the stuff they just talked about with temperatures and moisture and such, placement, if you have the opportunity to put it in furrow so that it's at or below the roots as it starts, then it'll get down deeper and help maintain better root growth down a little deeper quicker. If it's up on the surface and has to be going down, then several things enter into it. How heavy is the first rain? How often do you get rain? How deep is it penetrating? Are they really shallow rains? All those things. And the other thing is, as you get drier and drier at different times, water doesn't always refill the pores the same way after extremely dry situations. And microbes have the ability to be in the smallest of holes down in clay particles. And oftentimes water doesn't necessarily go into those clay particles if it's coated with all this wonderful organic matter that Iowa seems to be blessed with. Oftentimes organic matter is hydrophobic until it gets properly wetted, and then it'll allow water to go through. So in some cases you could actually put a little bit of soil penetrant in with a biological product and push it down into the soil and push it into the small pores faster and hold it longer and hold that moisture in those pores. And you'd be surprised how much longer the plant can harvest moisture when it's properly distributed around the soil. So instead of just always moving in and moving rapidly and going deeper so there's a lot of water there and we think, well, the roots will go get it. If you can actually move it in and move it all around in that material, clay material as it's going down and fill those pores evenly, there's a lot more water held and it's a lot more plant available water. So, I mean, that's a kind of a technical situation to think about, but it's real, and we've seen it many, many times. And the drier the soil is when it starts, the more prone it is to actually let water go down too fast, too deep in the soil, and it may move the microbes faster. The other thing would be is what Andy is purporting there. Then over time, there's a couple things you could do. You could actually, if we actually make these biological products a little more economical, or we use food sources with lower rates so that we can actually keep the net cost per acre down somewhat, and we use them in multiple applications. So let's say once at the very early part of the season, and then once maybe 30 days later, you can see dramatic increases in the way the root masses grow. As you saw the picture that Nate showed you this morning, where he had the 2x2 nitrogen, and you saw the differential in the way those roots grew, because it grew over where it found the it grew over where it found the nitrogen, and grew heavily there, and it didn't grow on the other side. We talk about this all the time. It's a reason why you should never overload the soil with too much fertilizer, because as the plants find the fertilizer, they stop growing the roots, so you'll have them too shallow. So, if you can move these systems with a little less fertility, make it a little more available in different places, and use the biology more often so that you get lots and lots and lots of finer roots, smaller roots and little root hairs, and you have that moisture and that biology in all these little spaces I'm talking about. Your harvesting of water is way, way more efficient. And that gets into some high-level mathematics and some other things, but it's reality. I mean, if you could make the root mass 10 to 100 times bigger by just putting on surface area, are you going to harvest fertility more efficiently out of the soil? The answer is yes. It's just kind of common sense. So on one row that didn't have the biology compared to one that did, if the root masses are better, you get more out of the same piece of soil. No matter what the soil test is, you get more out of the same piece of soil where the root mass is better.
So another topic, I guess, moving on, fungicide use. We've seen a lot of good crop health, plant health, with the use of the biology. And, you know, if I think back in the 90s, we didn't even know what fungicide was back then. And now it's a common practice. Everybody prepays and plans on putting fungicide on no matter what. Do we need that? And if we have better crop health, are we taking over the same can we do the same thing with good plant health via some foliar feed, some different things than we can with fungicide? Any comments?
You trying to make me mad?
Whatever it takes.
I would almost ask the group, what do you think? Raise your hands, but I don't want to embarrass anybody. But I've already seen the evidence of it. We saw it in tar spot out here for the last 2 years, where we actually put on fungicide with foliar treatments. That we're not talking about just an NPK treatment. We're talking about something like foliar blend plus with some potassium thiosulfate, where guys just use potassium thiosulfate with their fungicide, which, by the way, the fungicide is not labeled to control tar spot, and it obviously did not. Where they put potassium thiosulfate on there, they picked up 7 to 12 bushels. Where they put potassium thiosulfate in conjunction with something like foliar blend plus, they picked up 30. Tar spot was still on the leaf. The leaf of the corn never died. It died in a normal fashion. The stuff with just fungicide on it, and stuff with fungicide with foliar, and the foliar by itself, they were all three separated out. The stuff with fungicide just died. It just died. The fungicide didn't do anything. The lighter foliar treatment, it lived longer and delivered more. The full foliar treatment, with and without the fungicide, delivered way more. So then that's unique to tar spot, because some people were told last year that 3 applications of Ultima would take care of it. Some people put on 3 applications of Ultima. We didn't even have any tar spot. Now that corn was alive. So nothing was killing it. That's an extremely expensive program. And the guys who even had, if there was a little tar spot around, it still didn't do it. It's just, you know, it's hard to get that system to work on a disease that's mostly nutrient oriented. So if there are fungi present, and certain specific fungi, you don't play with gray leaf spot if you've got a very intolerant gray leaf spot variety. And if you see it out there, once again, you pull out the tools in the toolbox and you treat them. If you're using racehorse corns, which most of the GMO stuff is completely racehorse corns, you're going to have standability problems if you have either dry weather or nitrogen deficiencies or over-supplying of potash too early in the season. You're going to have standability issues. So a little fungicide is probably not a bad idea to try and improve the standability. But trust me, it's not coming from the fungicide unless there's fungi out there. It's coming from the ethylene inhibition portion of the fungicide, which is very readily discussed anymore. And it's because the plant is being slowed down by the ethylene inhibitor, and that's what's conserving the carbohydrates, and that's why the plant isn't cannibalizing as bad, and that's why it's not falling down. That's the same thing you just mentioned, Larry. That's all plant health, using biological and foliar feeding programs to make these things happen. The hard part is, because I don't know how many acres you've got in there, but we're talking about a whole bunch of people with a whole lot of unique situations, and you have to talk to those people all one-on-one on the phone. Sometimes that's easy to fix. Sometimes the combination of things is so unique, it's like, well, maybe it's just easier to put on a fungicide. And that's what people have done. They've just reached for the easy button and put on the fungicide. And hopefully, in most of the years we're making those applications, it's working. But trust me, if it goes on hot and dry for extended periods of time, the ethylene inhibitor and some sugar would buy way, way more bushels than a fungicide would.
For a lot less dollars.
A lot less dollars. You guys are a solemn bunch, I want to tell you.
I'd like to see them back.
Those applications that you're talking
Well, normally, we're looking at probably somewhere between 1 and 2 quarts of K-Thio and at least a half a gallon, or depending on how early you're doing it, a half a gallon to a full gallon, even 3-quart rate of foliar blend plus would be fine. In that situation, the more leaves you get material on, the better you're going to be. So, 2 gallons might be a risk. Most guys in airplanes don't want to fly fertilizer anyway because they think they got to put on 5 gallons. So, that's a different fight. If you got a Hagee and you can put it on, then I think even 7 gallons, if you're getting it across the top of the canopy, the timing is the same. The difference is what most people found 2 years ago is if they had tar spot on the plant, they automatically got worried and said, oh, it's too late, there's nothing you can do. That's not been our experience. We saw tar spot on the leaves when some of the foliar programs went on. Now, if you get it on before the tar spot gets on there, it's better yet. So still that same VT to R1 brown silk is perfectly fine. And if you want to put some fungicide in there, if you do see some fungi, or you think you want to have some fungal help if it looks like the weather is changing, even a half rate of fungicide is fine. I don't know why you put a full in there if it's a minimal amount of damage anyway, because it's not going to buy you that much extra time. But the timing is still the same, and the dollars that you save on the fungicide, depending on the fungicide you use, a lot of times pays for the foliar program. So there's not a lot of secrets here. It's not that you have to be perfect in your timing on something like this and or Goss's Will. I mean, Goss's Will is also a nutrient-based problem. That was a problem that was back in the 40s and 50s and the 1900s, and they bred that out. The only reason it came back was because we started changing all the genetics, inserting genes. The genes that were doing some of that work had to have gotten shipped out when it was done. So we're back to some of the problems we had back 100 years ago, or 75 years ago, just because the genetics have changed. When you take 8 genes and stuff them into different chromosomes, and pull pieces out and just jam something else in, all those chromosomes used to talk to each other, and now they still do, but in some cases they're not communicating very well because they don't know what those pieces are you put in there.
So do you think you could do that even a little bit pre-tassel and be okay
Yes.
to do?
Yeah. And again, if you want to put in a little higher rate to get it to be a little more effective, you can, but there's no need to like double or quadruple the rates. That's not going to help you that much more. I mean, up to about a gallon of that material of the foliar blend plus is plenty of material. That's a pretty good load for a corn crop and a bean crop, but especially in this case a corn crop.
So it needs to be a preventative more so than a treatment. In other words, if you start seeing,
Keep the plant healthy.
if you start seeing the tar spot there, and then you go in and apply, you may get some help, but you aren't gonna probably get as good a response as getting ahead of the thing and use it as a preemptive type of application.
Right, and a few lesions are one thing. And, you see tar spot, I mean, they can spread pretty rapidly. If you see a few lesions, I mean, it's not like you get immediately scared. It's like, oh my gosh, I really lost a lot. No, we're not talking about, a little bit of damage doesn't do too much damage. It's when you get significant quantities of lesions on every leaf down through the canopy that things go and they go down fast. So, that's the hard part is oftentimes they're going to tell us that, we're not going to see the lesions right away, even though it's infected, we're not going to see the lesions right away. So it's infected. But the nice part about this is once you allow the nutrients to get into that plant, the nutrients and the plant health hold off the spread of that tar spot from that point forward, keep the leaves alive and growing and functionally making the photosynthates to fill those kernels, and you're going to get more corn. That's just what's going on. It's no different than any other health situation, whether it's an animal, a human, anything else. The more disease we have, the harder it is on us.
I understand the perspective of not using a fungicide for the purpose of not hurting any beneficial fungal organisms. If you don't have a biology set up in your soil, is it still something that you'd recommend not doing?
You say, if you don't have the biology in your soil, what?
Would it be still something that you'd recommend not doing? I mean, if somebody that doesn't have any kind of, has made any practices, changed any practices to increase the biology in their soil, do you still recommend doing a foliar feed, something like what you're just saying. I mean, because
Oh, sure. You remember the picture that Andy put up there this morning when he told you that, if you don't have biology in your stomach, your immune system doesn't work? And so it's the same thing there. If you're not absorbing those nutrients through your stomach wall, you better figure out some way to get some vitamins or something in there, some other way, things to beef you up, because every little bit of stuff that you get is going to help you dramatically. So even if you haven't done the work to shift any biology in the soil yet, and you can actually, we have biology built in a little bit into the foliar blend plus anyway. It's got some biology in it for the plants on the surface. But yes, it still applies no matter whether you've done anything or not. Even though you'd say, well, I don't have much fungi left to kill in the soil, I kill it all. Well, the foliar feed is still going to work from that standpoint for you, because that's all relative to the plant. Now, from the soil standpoint, no, it's not going to regenerate things in that soil as quickly. But if there's also a little biology in the furrow down there, and you foliar feed the plants, when you foliar feed the plants, you stimulate their ability to make more food for themselves, and they make more food for the biology and root masses. And so now you get a doubling effect, if you will, of the plant. Because when you foliar feed the plant, and they feed the microbes in the soil, if there's moisture in the soil, there's nutrients coming back from the soil, from the microbe back into the plant, so it doubles up. That doesn't happen when you put fungicide on.
If you want to build your biology, you can build it somewhat through a foliar aspect. Maybe doing in soil and foliar would be better. But if you really wanted to build that soil biology, what would you recommend as a best course of action?
Manure.
If you don't have that, then what?
Sell a farm and go to Florida. Anything that's carbon-based is going to work as a food source in there. And that's one thing that, like humic acids and applications on the surface. And of course, so when you guys are in Iowa, you've got more total organic matter. One of the things that we've seen that Andy talked about early in his presentation in Iowa, where you've got so much organic matter, a lot of that organic matter that you're physically seeing in that soil is still cellulose. It still came from old corn and soybean plants and in cover crops, anything, and it's still in a cellulose form. That's very difficult to break down. And so the new cellulose degrading organisms that we're working with, once the cellulose degrading organisms produce the enzymes to break the cellulose down and start that process, as it begins to break down, it becomes simpler sugars. Once the simpler sugars are available, everybody in the biology realm of the soil can jump on and start eating those sugars. Now that they're all working in high gear, the faster they eat, the more carbon dioxide as they're respiring, just like you and I. We take in oxygen, we breathe out carbon dioxide. They're the same way. They're breathing that up into the canopy, and they're improving the growth of the plant, and as the growth of the plant improves, the roots get bigger. It's funny how they're all connected. So anything that will release carbon dioxide out of your soil, and these organisms are a part of that process, is going to improve that soil by taking organic matter that's just kind of sitting there and doing nothing for anybody. It's just stable, it's just sitting there. Let's turn it into something that's actually usable as a resource, because it's nice to get organic matter to go higher and higher and higher, but when we do, invariably it's like, well, we need more fertilizer to keep the levels up, and what good is all this organic matter if it keeps us wet and damp too long during the year, and is it staying too damp, is it getting too much fungus? I mean, it just goes on and on. So let's use organisms to turn that stuff into something valuable. And if we had, let's say, a 6 or 7% organic matter soil, and even if we said, I'd give up 2% of that organic matter, bring it down to 5, or maybe even 3 and bring it down to 4 for an extra how many bushels a year, just by tearing that organic matter and turning it into something when I got a canopy there to pull it in. Because what you find is it really won't go backwards that far. It'll actually just become better organic matter. And it may only go down to 5.5 or 6%, but you've got higher yielding crops as a result of having carbon dioxide released into the soil, because you took something that was going to, in a sense, not going to waste, but not really giving you anything, and turn it into a valuable input for microbes across the board. And trust me, at that point, it really doesn't matter what the microbes are. If there's simple sugars around and there's microbes, your natives and the guys that you put there, they're just looking for something to eat. When they find it, you're off to the races. So anything that has carbon, humic acid products, fulvic acid products, sugar products, and the microbes that can break down cellulose and lignin in your soil are always going to be a good thing. And done properly, even sprayed, during the season, I like to put those in wide drops. If people are putting on wide drops and I know I've got good organic matter soil, I'll either put in 100% stubble digester microbes, these lignin cellulose, the stuff that's in the biochar, or I'll mix biochar with biogreen if they want some nitrogen manufacturing capabilities and some other things. I mix them up. And this is where I think the whole thing of biology is coming in the future. It's no different than what we used to do. I mean, what was in Bicep? Bicep was basically just, dual and atrazine. Now, you could buy dual, and you could buy atrazine, but most people realize, well, if I'm going to use it anyway, let's put them together. It's the same thing in this technology as it was in that. It's just, using the tools in the toolbox a little more effectively.
I'm curious on CRP ground that's been CRP for 10, 15, 20 years versus, somebody that's in a corn bean rotation, and you go in and test that CRP ground, you're talking about how these biologicals have been diminishing over time. Does that CRP ground, will that refurbish itself with these biologicals? Have you seen that in your testing? We've been no-tilling for 30 years now. And you talk about a process, and so breaking down the cellulose, if we've been in this for 30 years, the process is ongoing, year after year after year. Does that help in a system like that?
Definitely.
Yeah. It seems from what I've seen, the biological activity is always significantly higher off of CRP ground. It's been inactive commercially for several years because there's no competition with bugs that are there. So you get a higher population of what should be there. So kind of that same effect when you first take out a tree line and
With your fence row.
take out your fence row, and it's always a little bit higher because they've had no environmental competition for however long. They're still there.
And the way you understand that is if you actually look at the soil in those scenarios, isn't the soil really well granulated? And that granulation is a direct impact of what the biology's been doing to change and incorporate that organic material into things that have been consistently being made plant available. So the plant is always feeding the soil, and the soil is always feeding the plant, and they are working together. And so this is exactly what we're talking about. And the other thing you got to think about is creating uniformity of that biology. So for instance, if you knew you were going to take CRP out next year, and you wanted to make sure that some of the biology that was in some of Andy's BioGreen was out there, you could go out there and spray that in the spring or summer of the year before you take it out. And some of that biology is going to develop with that plant and that root system. And then when you tear it up, it's going to be there. And there's going to be a little more uniformity. Otherwise, you may get different colonies of different microbes set up in different places all across that field. And it doesn't mean that the biology is low, the biology is still high. It just won't have the same uniformity. And so if you actually wanted to get more uniformity, you could put that out there before you turn that stuff down, and then if you went out there the first year after you started planting into that CRP and put another load out there with your planter or spray it again, you'll develop more uniformity in that field with biology. That's what it would do.
Is that kind of the thing? Does biology colonize? And as producers, we want to have good biology around every seed.
Yeah. So, I think the easiest way that it makes sense in my brain is, we all have different hobbies, and the biology they gravitate towards particular things that they like, whether it's certain crop species or certain soil types where they break down, but they'll find they are attracted to whatever can provide them with the most energy or the right sugar form. So they do kind of develop into pockets and gravitate towards things that are more favorable to them. But we don't see that a lot in corn and bean rotations because it's pretty uniform. But off of CRP ground that we're talking about, we would have.
And now, was that David that asked that question?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, and David, it's a good point. because, oftentimes we try to make this thing a little more complicated than it has to be. But something as simple as seed treatments, I mean, we've been selling seed treatments now for the last 5 years and developing more and more biology into those seed treatments. And as we get more serious adoption of these products by the seed companies and even farmers themselves who have just said, well, the seed companies don't want to open up the boxes, and so we have to overtreat and do it, and they've started putting on the seed treatments. And, we have, Larry has a product, BioST. We have been using similar formulations in our product out here. And you can, because the counts are really high, of the different microbes that are in there, the counts are really, really high. So it only takes a fine misting of that material to go onto every single seed. And now what you've done is you have pre-inoculated every seed as its place with that diversity of biological base. All those different microbes, they're there. And so they actually communicate with that seed, I want you to grow. I want that stuff on the other side of the seed coat. And I will help you grow if you will germinate, send me roots and send me food, I will help you grow. There's a communication established. And so some of the easiest ways to do that, and it's not expensive, I mean, we're looking at something that's like $1.50 to even $2 an ounce at the most. And we're only looking at 2 to 3 ounces per 100 pounds of seed. It's one of the quickest and easiest ways to make sure that uniformity at least gets some establishment in a quick and easy fashion. And if you don't have setups to be able to do things in furrow, just like that, you've got instant inoculation. So seed treatment is something, if you haven't been doing, because if you want to see the difference between fungicide and no fungicide and biologicals, and see what they're capable of doing, those chemicals on those seeds, they coat and they slow down the early growth. You take a naked seed and put biology on it, get it to germinate as fast as it can, get its roots out, get it established with biology on it. That's where the immune system comes from. It's no different than a child, that's breastfeeding rather than taking a bottle. It's no different. All the enzymes and stuff in the mother's milk and the enzymes and stuff in these mother's microbes, if you will, are doing the same thing. So if you have not been considering seed treatment in the future, seriously look into it, because we've got a lot of people now that have, you can do it with soybean, you can't do it with corn. Nobody sends out corn anymore with it. I think all the Beck stuff, is all pre-treated, if I'm not wrong. They won't send out naked seed anymore because they all have a replant thing that they're doing. But we've got a lot of data from farmers themselves, not so much in-house, but farmers themselves like, man, the beans are out of the ground in 3 days when the temperatures were right, and they never look back. And so we do a lot of that.
We do a lot of that here too, and that's about a home run every time. I mean, it's a no-brainer. We've actually got a seed dealer that's actually putting it on some corn, and we've seen some good response on corn. We've done 2 years, replicated stuff. Well, I shouldn't say replicated, but we've done some side by side, half the planter with, half the planter without, and I think this last year we saw about a 2.4 bushel average in corn with the seed treatment.
That's a seed company treatment, or
That's our seed, our BioST. It's an overspray. We're putting it on corn. And the seed companies don't know about it, probably, but we're doing it. Well, I don't
put it over the corn.
running it through the
Spray
seed.
it on the seed as it's getting loaded into the.
And we do a lot of beans. We sell a lot of acres worth of seed treatment. So if you don't have in furrow, that's the next best thing to put it on the seed, if you can. And then we actually have some guys doing it on the seed and then putting a little bit over top on a stream as well.
And to tie back to what Andy had mentioned earlier about a team approach in biology, there's a number of inoculants out there that you're going to get 1 or maybe 2 or 3 strains of biology in those inoculants, whereas in ours you're getting, Dan, Andy, I don't know how many strains, but it's more than just nitrogen fixers. You're getting a whole slew of different bugs there.
So we deal a lot, Dan, and you know this too, but we deal a lot with high pH areas in our farms around here, and see a lot of yellow beans in spots in the field where we've got iron chlorosis.
Yeah.
That's probably our best. If we can't do in furrow, that's probably our best defense against that, is put it on the seed, and we see very little iron chlorosis, and if you do, it's short-lived.
Yeah, that's correct, because most iron chlorosis in situations like that where the pH is high is actually fixed by biology. You'll see a lot of times in the fields that are really bad, it won't fix it at all. but a lot of times in certain fields that are kind of living on the edge, you'll see, once the soil begin to get kind of warm and moist in late May, early June, and the beans are out there, all of a sudden the bean starts to change color. That's because the biology that's doing that work, a lot of times it's Pseudomonas organisms, and one of the reasons we've seen problems with that over the years is the glyphosate was extremely hard on the Pseudomonas populations. It's one of the most susceptible groups of organisms that get wiped out by glyphosate. So as the Pseudomonas got beat down, it wasn't making manganese, it wasn't making iron, and so you had a lot more problems at high pH with iron and manganese both be tying up. So it's like, wow, this isn't hard to fix. So we went in there and started putting in the biology so that the biology was growing with it from the day it germinated, and lo and behold, the problem got less. The other thing is, if it's iron relations in a soybean, if when the rhizobium touches the root of the soybean to make a nodule, if iron is not available immediately upon that touching, both systems shut down and there is no nodule. So the reason you don't see green beans is because you fill them up like, well, there's no nodules on these things. Well, that's because there's no iron. Fix the iron, you fix the nitrogen problem. And the other thing that's about this is your fusarium that you have out there. The fusarium is very successful at making the iron available for itself, the organism, fusarium, and starving the bean. So the worse the problem is for the bean, the better the situation is for the fusarium, and so fusarium turns into soybean sudden death syndrome. That's it. So in low iron availability fields, soybean sudden death syndrome is by nature's worse. It always has been. Between corn and soybeans, and even wheat now, with all the different fusarium diseases we have out here, it's no surprise that glyphosate fed the whole thing for years and years. And so now we're paying the price in some cases for all the stuff that we've had, our sins of the past. Turn it around with the biology in the right way, it goes away really quickly.
That's, I think, very overlooked.
No question.
I had a guy, I can't remember if it was 2016 or 17, somewhere there, where we had bad sudden death around this area, especially with some different genetics around here. We had a lot of sudden death, and I had a grower that put the seed treatment on and the microgold talc replacement on everything except his last fill of planter, because he didn't need a whole bag or something, or he just had a little bit of acres left. There was 13 bushel difference on that last little bit on the field he had that in, where he didn't put the BioSD and the microgold on.
Yeah. Well, we had one of your customers that, years ago when he first found out about it, he had a terrible field, and he said, the field that he put it on, he was willing to try anything and everything, because they had done, soy green and all the other stuff for years. And
Yep.
very first year, he said that field had never yielded over 28, 29 bushels average in its entire life, and the first year it was about 58 to 60.
Well,
And people didn't even recognize the field, they didn't think about the field, it's just like a soybean field like it's supposed to. And he said, if you remember, that was always the yellowest field in the county.
yeah, there's a lot of fields around here that way. And the first years we started using that program, instead of having 65 to bushel beans on the good parts of the field, going down to mid-20s on the high pH areas where you had chlorosis, and then coming back, our averages were in the 50s, and now our average, that first year we did that, he hauled it across the scale at Duncan, and that field averaged 73 bushels across the whole field.
That's a conspiracy theory.
So is that when the prices went down on beans?
Could be.
Yeah, you guys have create your own demise on the bean market by using biology.
So in that case with the high pH, if you could double or triple your rate in those areas, would you do it?
I think I would double. I don't know if there's necessary to go to triple.
Well,
Because the thing
more
that
is good, then even more is better.
What's that?
I said if more is good, then even more is better.
Yeah, we've experienced that in agriculture through the years. You gotta be careful
It's called the
when you get into.
moron theory.
Yeah,
The moron. No, seriously, what would
just
you do?
convince the banker.
I mean, because we, up by us, we got, and I'm asking, 'cause I don't know, we have high pH pockets, a lot of IDC, but it's compounded once it just follows sugar beets. But that sugar beet program, I mean, it's a 7 fungicide, 2 copper, 4 herbicide program past sugar beets. And so, how do we revive that soil in those high pH pockets?
you can use higher rates of microbes in certain situations with certain crops, but you've got to be very careful. Because what happens is, in biology, just like everything else, it's no different than thinking about the difference in the population of Wyoming compared to the population of New Delhi. When you get so many mouths to feed, it takes a lot of food to sustain it, and if you actually have too many people, you run out of food and things begin to go backwards in a hurry. It's the same thing with biology. You can get counts up so high that if you get so much to feed, you gotta have nitrogen and some other things to feed it. So you can only go so high before you still get some benefit, but you're getting a reduced amount of benefit the higher you go with the level of the microbes. And that's why I'm saying, I had a guy that actually doubled or tripled the rate of the seed treatment 2 years ago by accident. He had the machine set wrong. And I said, well, did you have a bad situation or good one? He said, well, it was 9 to 12 bushels better side by side. He says, can I continue to do that? I said, the bank says you can. Just be careful. See, that's a seed treatment, so that's a limited amount of area. But if you were to put this in the furrow at, let's say, 2 pints, 3 pints, 4 pints, that's a no-no. Because you're gonna have way too much growing way too fast. It's gonna consume nutrients and begin to demineralize the soil by the microbes eating up all the available.
What stops that from happening in regular biology? Let's say we're not using biologicals and we're just using we got animals incorporated into the mix. We got a pasture for 4 years, then corn, soybeans, oats. Let's just say this biology is overall there. What stops that same situation that you're talking about from happening in nature?
If it's ruminant biology too, along with that manure and such, that can happen, but when it's more diversified and it's spread out a little farther, it's not as critical. Now, the same thing can happen. If you were using dry beef manure, for instance, and you put on 2 to 4 ton of dry beef manure, no big deal. I had a guy accidentally, I say accidentally, he said, I got a problem, I can't grow corn anymore. It's taking me 300 or 400 units of nitrogen to grow corn under the pivot. I'm like, what in the world? Well, he said they gave me free manure, so I put on 28 to 30 ton of dry beef manure. And I said, have you ever heard about a carbon to nitrogen ratio? No, I've never heard about that. And I said, well, obviously not. Now, after 5 years, when the soil biology finally got done eating up that whole mess, he was only using 150 units to grow more than 300 bushel of corn, because the carbon to nitrogen ratio shifted back the way it should have, that he almost lost the farm in the meantime. So the difference is, with what you're talking about, this whole idea of working all these pieces together, as you diversify the biology, spread it out, and make, especially when you diversify the cover crop, the cover crop will kick out amino acids, which are sugars with nitrogens married on them. And when you've got more amino acids and you've got more nitrogen, you're buffering against some of those changes dramatically. So it's not as critical in that scenario, because it's pretty hard to upset the balance too much. It's when you're starting to put down billions and billions and billions of microbes in a tiny little band, right in the situation where a seed is going to germinate and try to grow and find food, and they start eating up the minerals right in that little band, instead of making it available, it's being tied up. So it's a little bit different story than what we just explained.
I was wondering if somebody wanted to address like the proven 40 and Vito or Vita whatever as compared to what you guys might recommend. Because proven 40, they've got a huge advertising budget. You found that out.
Plus, that's California too.
Yeah.
I don't wanna get political here, but
I'll jump in and I'll say that there's a couple big differences on both of those products, primarily just one microbe each. Vita's got one bug, Improved 40, I think it's 2, but there's one that does a lot of the work. So that's one difference is that we label 3, there's actually a few more in there that are doing some work that we don't claim because they're in lower counts. So we've got a lot larger diversity. The counts on ours are a little higher, so it doesn't take nearly as much. And then the other thing, one of the biggest things, aside from all that, is that we're using the water system, so the oxygen percentage and the available carbon that comes out of using this is significantly higher than using the others. So the total package makes it kind of more comprehensive than just one how people are using it and how it's being incorporated when they mix it with herbicides and pesticides and things, so, there's still some unknowns that go with it.
Nate, you've done some research on that too, haven't you?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll speak like with Invita, we started doing foliar testing with that a couple of years ago. And we actually went back in the last 3 years of data and found that through our, when we looked at application dates and looked at some weather tracking software, where we saw it working foliar, the applications were made under the label recommendation of 77 degrees. Well, the challenge with this product is when are we gonna apply under 77 degrees in the month of June? You know, and that's early mornings, evenings, etc. So we, in a way, no offense, biological products kind of do set themselves up for fail in the sense that we gotta watch temperatures, we gotta watch the water carrier, we gotta watch what else is in the tank, how long it's in the tank with that product. 1034O, that's killing a lot of the biology that we're putting in it as a carrier. So we can do things to buffer those salts, but it's best to just look at them whole. So in our research, we tried to eliminate those to see what the maximum capacity or capabilities of the product is, and then we reverse it back to a practical application. Nutrition N, Corteva's product, we saw really good responses to that when we used RO water or conditioned well water. City water has chlorine, and guess what has on the label? You know, it's not recommended to be used with chlorinated water. And so it's a lot of these fine-tuned things that we really have to make sure the plants are aligned on. Pivot Bio, I won't say what our data says because their formulation changed every year for the last 3 years now. And I think that's okay. I think it's okay that they're advancing that. However, it's hard to build recommendations when it's, okay, well now this is the change and this is the recommendation, or it's better to be applied this way than it was last year. So I just think the industry as a whole is really trying to keep up now because the only negative I feel towards some of the bigger biological companies is the marketing is getting ahead. So now we as farmers feel like we're catching up. And then that's what I said earlier. We have one bad experience and we just want to rule all of them out altogether. If this is the biological realm, this is what we know today, and this is what we'll know next year. But we all feel like we need to know this right now. So that was a long answer to it, and it's probably the best agronomist answer of it depends, right? Skating around it, but the reality is it's just when we're using them, how they're going to be used, we're seeing really strong responses to it. It just is there the practical application for that method.
That's what's difficult, is to,
It's not chemistry, it's biology, it's a living thing, it changes, and, you know, we do the best that we can.
we've seen good responses to those programs,
Yeah.
but to the Invita, I've sold Invita, and again, sold Nate, I think too, putting replenish with it was positive as well, so,
We could widen the application window when we started to condition water, right? If we condition the water, then maybe it was 80 degrees or 82 degrees. When we put it in furrow with a biostimulant or food source, then we could get by with putting it in with starter fertilizer or less of a water carrier. So when you start to couple the beneficial things, you widen the parameters of what the potential success of the product is.
And congratulations, you just became an official agronomist that way. Because, you know, I hate to say it, and we shouldn't laugh, but it is the reality of it. You know, we're taking, the one thing that we're doing here is we're bringing in companies' products, and we're making marriages out of those products to make superior solutions. Companies sell a product, they only have a product to sell in most cases, or maybe two. And so they're hamstrung by what their product's capable of and what the rates are and everything else. Everything that we've been talking about today, guys, if you haven't figured this out, this is all about trying to figure out how to create the best out of what we're finding of these good products. Let me ask you a question across the board. How many of you would want to put out Pivot Bio and cut out 40 units of nitrogen? Or would you rather put the Pivot Bio out there and hope it made 40 more? And 95% of the people I talked to said, I want to put it out here and make 40 more. That's not their warranty program, and it doesn't even do that. The whole objective of that was to be able to cut nitrogen out. That's one of the reasons why the environmentalists Love the whole idea of it because you won't put out as much nitrogen. Now, none of us need to put out any more nitrogen than is necessary, but you also can't mix that product with anything else. Now, anybody that knows that they're trying to grow big corn, especially if they've got on-seed starters, the reason they're using the on-seed starters is to make big corn. So the reason that we've never really been beaten by a pivot bio product in the side-by-sides is because there's so many more organisms in here, up to 14 to 16 that focus on nitrogen. You've got sulfur oxidizers, phosphate releasers, iron releasers, zinc releasers, potash releasers, as well as root mass increasers, and a whole host of other things, including immunity response. It's not that it's a bad product, it just doesn't fit the model unless you're a guy that just wants to go out and put on 125 units of nitrogen and grow 185 bushel crop on low inputs and not pay anything. Oh, it makes wonderful sense then. But I'd say probably that's less than 1% of the corn growing population. Did that quiet the crowd down? I got a question for Nate. When he was going through some stuff in there, he said that a seed company probably shouldn't be talking about lower stands with higher yields. Why not?
Are you trying to make me mad?
But what's interesting is we've always talked about some of the stuff that we do around here, and this is kind of an example of it. Nobody is actually saying that they should cut the seed, but what's interesting is if you do cut the seed and you do get higher yields, and the neighbors notice it, they're going to sell a whole lot more seed anyway. At least that's the way it's supposed to work.
Yeah.
But we look at a lot of these things this way. Because we haven't seen it, and the follow-up question I had to that, because I got to get one from the seed guy every once in a while, otherwise I never get any chances anymore. But if you're talking about all the improved mechanics that you saw, and by the way, that was a wonderful presentation. I'm assuming you got a lot of pats on the back, because that stuff was really good, and I wish I had you down here to talk about that for mine all next week. But as you begin to see improvements in the mechanicalization of these machinery, those pieces of machinery, have you noticed anything, or have you done any studies about where we start using these programs now? Do we get less variability? Would we get less overall yield responses? Because I've seen some situations where mechanics way out trump fertility. Have you seen any evidence of that, or have you checked it?
Yeah, I don't know about fertility, but the mechanics are starting to overweight the population. That's why I joked about that, because I am a proponent for lowering the population to not planting more than what we need. And when we can singulate it, when we can place it better, and when we can manage it better, we do see a better response to letting even that fixed determinate year flex to its maximum capacity. So no, I would say where you're going with this question is accurate, because there are a lot of agronomic fundamentals that we're re-looking at when we start implementing all this precision and accuracy, because you don't need to have the buffering zone of a little bit higher nitrogen or a little higher population. But yes.
What do you see with variable rate corn and or beans? Is there a response in your mind?
I have not seen a response to variable rate. Variable rate soybeans I have in our real high pH IBC prone pockets. We're increasing population to kind of split that load up a little bit, put one line of break out there. So we're seeing a nice response to that. But the variable rate corn, I'm struggling to see the ROI on the higher seeded areas.
So how do you come back to that? I think on the corn, I think again, like you said, Nate, I agree with, on the soybeans, it's a big deal. And lowering populations on the good producing areas of the field is probably the biggest advantage there. But on the corn, I think more than anything, maybe not so much variable rating in corn, but setting the right population per hybrid is probably the bigger thing. Let's not just set your planter at 34.5 and go plant all your acres, because that doesn't fit.
And I think with all the flex hybrids coming out, you find that sweet spot and let the hybrid determine its maximum capability in soil.
We did a pot study last year. We had two different hybrids. One was determinate, one was true flex. I always do this to determine, because if you have 50% of your stand come up on a true fixed hybrid, it's still pretty nice. And, it's just in those small incremental changes, but the old rule of thumb is, well, you gotta push your population to just enough tip line, okay? We hear that a lot, and I throw that out, I don't use that rule because I saw at the lowest pop and the highest pop, 15,000 pop difference between the same tip. That was just an expression of that genetics. So it's very determinant upon what hybrid it is, so, yeah, you're right, you gotta watch what hybrid will put the most pops at. Manage it for them. We're implementing through a revival, a new protocol next year that really takes a look at the hybrid. We're gonna push it between, some real high populations and low populations. And low nitrogen rate, high nitrogen rate, 2x2x2 nitrogen placement versus a late season wide drop nitrogen, and then with and without R6 or B6 fungicide, and then R1 fungicide. All in one study. And that should really push the boundaries of what this product and characterization looks like, and how we do best manage that.
If you tested dual hybrid planting, stress areas versus high production areas.
Yeah, same response to that as corn. Soybeans that dual hybrid on corn, we didn't see the justification. On soybeans, we did. But in that same study, we also blended the two beans together 50-50 and saw the same response to multi-variety and multi-hybrid. So we love the P-Set Select in our research farm because we have it set up where corn's in the front hopper, beans is in the back hopper. So when we're doing these in-furrow tests, if it's the same rate at corn or beans, all we have to do is change the monitor to beans, change the planting depth, and we go right into corn and beans. So from a logistics standpoint, the P-Set Select is awesome for us, but it's not going to be practical.
Well, I was piggyback. And I don't have the side by side tell, but where we have BRT for corn, I don't think we necessarily enhanced the yield, I don't think we've heard it, but where we reduced the population on the west directed area of the field, I'd say the cost of the seed. You know, I buy the seed with flat rate that I probably would plant, we get the BRT done, and I'm taking some bags back. And I don't think I've hurt the yield.
Do you think you've increased standability with that?
Possibly. Possibly, because it's the stretched areas that aren't gonna ever be the high part of the field probably, and so you don't have much competition there, it's probably.
That's one thing it's one of those, how do you measure that?
Right.
Yield standpoint.
Right, so it's just like instinct and my impression, I don't have a, sorry if I said I really know.
You gotta be a better planner when you're doing planter, not planter, but planner when you're doing it, because you want to be, when you make prescriptions for planting seed, you need to stick with your plan. Because, or have multiple prescriptions, because you don't wanna screw up and put a different hybrid in your planter that requires higher population than
No.
when we get to the
Yeah,
planter.
we stick to the plan, we have a plan, we
Yeah.
stick to it.
Well, the other thing I would suggest is, when you run those studies, make sure that, if the very first year you run those studies, it's a dark and cloudy spring for 2 or 3 weeks, that there's another study done somewhere else in the rest of the world that hopefully doesn't have that. Otherwise, you're gonna have to run it for 2 or 3 years because, all those things are dependent. We always talk about the weather. You said, well, it's dependent on the weather. Well, weather has a lot to do with that. So, especially on the year formation side, if I've seen years where everybody had 16s. The only thing that caused that was because it was 3 weeks of cloudy weather during year formation time. It didn't matter what you had, there just wasn't enough sunlight to go around, and so that's what they made. And so even hybrids that were 18 to 22 normally were 16 that year.
Very good discussion. We're getting past some of what our time limit probably is. We can stand around and talk all afternoon if you want. But if you guys need to go, I understand.
This business on sulfur, I guess one of the main, because we're alluding to the importance of having sulfur on throughout the season. I guess we've been putting most of our sulfur on in the early end of the season. We had some discussion about maybe having some sulfur on later as well. Would you guys discuss sulfur and for I guess? And like I said, we had been getting it all on early.
this is something that Dan can very much allude to, and why, yes, maybe it will help in season later, but it's critical up front.
It's critical early.
The people who use ATS have seen some phenomenal responses, and all of the 32 communities like this, the ATS has been phenomenal in bringing that salt.
So how soon? I mean, is that like phosphorus uptake in the very early stages?
Go, Dan, go.
You say go, Dan, go?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, hold on, here we go. It's critical by V3 when the ear has already set the total number of rows around. So this way, on the out's diameter. And by V5, you've got the entirety of the ear length already predetermined. In all that stages, you're laying down all your ovules, all your seeds, if you will. And every one of those seeds has to have that zine deposit put into it so that at pollination, when the pollen grain goes down the silk and touches, if it does not have that zine protein, it will not fill. So it just like everything else, it fills from the butt up to the tip. And so whenever you've seen those ears with that little tiny pointed, soft tip, not the rough, rugged one that we see when we think about them aborting kernels, but that soft, fluffy tip where you see all kinds of little places where kernels could be, but there's no kernels there. Oftentimes what that is, that's a sulfur deficiency when the corn plant is at B2 to B3. So you've got to get that in there in the initial, it's either got to get in there through the seminal roots or the radical root, because those are the only roots present. So either has to be some in the furrow or some in the 2x2, and you hope to pray to God you didn't smash the sidewall where the 2x2 is and the roots went the wrong way. It's a sulfur deficiency when the corn plant is this tall. So getting it in there, and sulfur is, zine is a sulfur-dependent protein. And there are many like that. There are 3 essential amino acids and 3 essential proteins that are essential that are sulfur-bearing. And so as the government has cut back on sulfur, the reason a lot of sulfur studies don't work is their timeliness isn't correct. You can't put ammonium sulfate on at D8 and expect to have an ear impact. It's over. So you might make a nice corn with high good test weight and fill up the kernels nicely, but you didn't make any bigger ear. So it's got to be done on the early side. So either a quart or 2 of potassium thiosulfate or some K-Row or something in the furrow, or 2 or 3 to 5 gallon on the side in the 2x2 band, or even with what Nate was showing this morning with the 2x2x2. If you get some sulfur in there so that the roots can find it on the early side, you have an opportunity to make a bigger ear when the ear is flexible enough to allow it to do it.
If you're putting on ammonium or ATS or gypsum, if you're putting on AMS or gypsum, it's a broadcast application, pre-plant or something like that, assuming there is such a thing as normal moisture to take the sulfur down, do you think you have enough there at that early stage, or concerned about that, do you think something in furrow or like do?
As long as it's a water-soluble form. If it's water-soluble form and there's water moving around and you put on those levels, you should be fine.
But,
You gotta put on the levels.
but to address that though, think how much more available you have over that, either a 2x2 or a stream versus a broadcast.
That's what I said, you gotta get the
Yeah.
levels. I just saw
It's
a
all about
report.
concentration.
I just saw a report a couple weeks ago. It was from just a farmer trial when he had done, but he went up to 300 pounds of AMS and compared that to 5 gallons of ATS. And the new response was similar, around 200 to 250 pounds of AMS broadcast incorporated versus that 5 gallons of ATS. So it's taking,
It's got 3
your
times as
sulfur.
much sulfur, but
So the sulfur to nitrogen ratio around that band was so much much higher in the 30-inch broadcast versus that.
So instead in the broadcast, we were talking 25 to 30 pounds of sulfur needed, not that way back by going with ATS band.
But I'm still putting on that 20. I'm still putting on that 20 to 25 pounds, but I'm putting here versus
I'm not saying cut back, but I'm saying get it closer to the seed.
the amount of AMS to get that same equivalent, that same ratio. So
And it needs to be in balance with the phosphate. It's one of the things that nobody wants to talk about. One of the dirty little secrets is, they started cutting out sulfur years ago. Phosphate, in some cases, if you've had manure, is off the scale. Or if you're putting in 1034O off the side, or lots and lots of orthophosphate on the seed, you need to balance the phosphorus and the sulfur. The only way you can do that is exactly what Nate and the other guys were talking about there, is you've got to band it and keep the parts per million up so close to the seed that the total concentration has an opportunity to offset the balance of some of that other phosphate. Nobody talks about that. I think there's, like I said, 30 to 40 years of missing agronomy that we try to cover in about 2 or 3 hours here, so congratulations.
And if you talk about closing wheels, you mentioned what the filters, they work well to the right and the left. Do you have a recommendation if somebody's got a single closing wheel on a grill? They have some issues closing that furrow.
Yeah. I don't have personal experience with it in research or my research, but working with some growers in South Dakota, that cast iron furrow cruiser from Copperhead Egg seems to be a pretty good solution for that. It's heavy enough and it's not too aggressive where it's breaking through to the other side of the seed.
Just briefly, the old days, and the reason that I'm here and the reason he's here is 14 years ago, he and I met in Florida, but I came up to his part of the world on the north side of the Minnesota Island line in 2009, 2010, and started working with the products. And at that time, we were putting it in furrow. We didn't know. It was a good product, but then it became concentrated. So in essence, we were putting a quart of the dark carbon, the RSPC 17 cetane, with 5 gallons of water, spraying directly on the seed, going up against 1034, 624, 6, and nothing, or just water. And of course, we saw a yield response. And but the thing I think that you can expound upon is from the grid sample, soil sampling, how we saw more PK available. And that's kind of what piqued your interest is that how are you doing that by just putting this energized carbon in furrow?
Yeah, for us it was really, I've got decent organic matter, 5 to 5.5. I call that decent, but that's pretty good. We've got 20 to 25 cc. We have a high cc because of our calcium levels of real high part per million or base saturation. So we can put on 200 pounds of that just to see enough of phosphorus availability in the corn crop, but not good builders. When we were building jackals with manure, what we started to see with the use of energized carbon is we were stimulating the process where we were making more available nutrients from that organic matter and or releasing it from that bound up calcium. So that was in a matter of about 5 years that we started to see those increases in soil tests consistently. To the point of, I think we heard earlier, the use of humics and fulvics, carbon products that, you know, the use of too much can be a bad thing, right? We overdo it. And so I think we're putting the right dose on where we're stimulating, keeping that biology active, and seeing that response in the soil. So it wasn't just the germination, getting everything off to the right start. It was also the balance of making more available nutrients around that root zone as that plant was growing and developing bigger roots. So that was without any biology. That was just a stimulant in furrows.
You know, long before any of these biologicals or the micronutrients or sugar products and, you know, all that this was 5-6 years before any of that came along. And that was sub $3 corn and sub $9 beans. And we were showing a positive ROI back in that day, years ago. So this is where we've now found a better synergy with these other products that you've heard about today. Again, using something that's pure carbon with energy and oxygen, because those are the parameters that those biologicals are going to need to find somewhere. And if it's not readily available, then they can't do as much as we want them to do. So we're about the synergy of making everything work better. Now the differentiation, one quick thing. You may have heard of carbon, and somebody may have come around and told you about humic acid recently or in the last 2 or 3 years, or they haven't gotten there yet. But one thing I will tell you, I spent 5 solid years studying carbons, these humics and fulvics and other things from 2005 until 2010. Seems like a lifetime ago. But I spent years out west of the Rockies, anywhere from California to Idaho, where these products have been used for 30, 40, 50 years. what's so unique is that there is not a humic, to me, I don't understand the terminology, and you won't hear me say it very often, but Dan alluded to it, but humic acid is a misnomer to me. There's no such thing. Even the product that I start with is the purest humic on earth out of Jacksonville, Florida, that came from Canada and was processed with food-grade potassium hydroxide. Is actually, the powder is registered in California as 12% organic potash by CDFA. They determined that it's not just a humic, it's because of the 12% organic potash in it, it's really a fertilizer. So anyway, if you take and dissolve that powder in water, it'll be a pH of 9, and it'll be a negative 100 oxygen. Now that is not something that we'll see. The farmers out west figured that out a long time ago. They don't put humic acid, as they call it, in furrow. The difference here is that I take the raw humic and I add energy and oxygen to it. So our products are a pH of 2 and a pH of 1, tremendous amount of hydrogen energy, but then they're also a positive 250 to 300 molecular oxygen. So all humics are not created equal. I start with the same thing they do, but we invented a process to add the energy and oxygen. So we're delivering you something different, and we're not just wanting you to use it to replace anything. We want you to use it to supplement what you already do. That's the benefit of farmers' products. It's a total synergy is bigger with everything working together.
And what is it we say that the tillage does to the soil? What does tillage do to the soil? It brings in oxygen and stimulates microbial growth because they find enough air. The biggest limiting factor in most soils is oxygen, not necessarily in sands, but definitely in heavy silt loams, silty clay loams, and clay loams and clays. So all George is doing basically is providing a food source with the available oxygen so that the microbes actually do the same type of thing that tillage does, except they do it in a controlled area and give the benefits directly to the plant because it's right in the seed zone. So it's no surprise, and it's not difficult to understand. It's just we talk about it in so many different ways because it's like, oh, well, tillage is a bad thing. Well, tillage is a good thing. It could be bad, but it's a good thing. But you know, let's say, well, humic acid is the same across the world. No, it's not. And George just made that point. He just told you why. So he actually is making a better environment for every microbe that runs into his stuff because it's a food source at the right pH for them, and it has oxygen in it.
And I'll give you a simple tool. If anybody ever comes to you and tells you they got a humic product, just ask them one simple question right at the door. What is the analysis? What is the NPKRS? Because if it does not have, if it's 0000, it's never been activated, and it's useless. It's a filler, it'll fill up a hole, but it will not be biologically available for 1 to 200 years. That product is cheap, they mine it, they just bring it right to you in whatever container you want them to bring it in, but it has no biological value unless it's been activated. And there's 4 ways to activate humic today in common practice: aqua ammonia, phosphoric acid, potassium hydroxide, or sulfuric acid. You're going to get an NPKRS residual in that, just like the product I'm talking about that I start with has a 12% organic potash residual. So it's just quick and easy. If you ever have somebody come around and want to sell you some black stuff, ask them what the analysis is first, and if it says 000, just leave them at the door.
So what, on an organic phosphate, what percentage is base?
Well, pound for pound, it's 12%. Yes, sir. If you took the raw powder, pound for pound, it'd be 12% organic.
Great discussion. I'll say it again, several people have had to leave already, but guys, we'll kind of end it here, and if you want to stay after, you sure can, and ask the questions. But thank you all for coming. Appreciate your attendance today. Hopefully it was worth your while.